Well, hi, and welcome back to a special edition of Risk Management. No PowerPoints today and no special shows, just your professor speaking to you. This is a transitional lecture, and what I'm trying to do is show you where we've come from and where we're going a little bit. The first 25, 30 lectures in this class, we spent investigating what is a risk, how do we measure a risk, what's the probability of a risk, the phenomenology behind a risk and causation, all those sorts of principles. And then we got into financial risk, and I provocatively turned everything on its head for you, or at least I hope you saw that. That up until that point, we'd been talking about very controlled, measured forms of knowing risk and distinguishing between risk and uncertainty. And then we got into the financial risk realm, and what I effectively did was to say you can't define a risk and you can't know risks in advance. That things are so complex that we can't measure volatility in advance, that volatility breeds more volatility, that it scales, and so that when you get out to the fat ends of the curve, you don't actually know how far out on the risk curve you're going to go. It could be the 1 in 100 year event that occurs. It could be the 1 in 10,000 year event that occurs. It could be the once in a millennium event that occurs. And you don't know in advance how unlikely something is going to be until it occurs. And more volatility is bred by more volatility. Once something becomes volatile and a hurricane starts, more hurricanes are likely to follow. Once the pre-shocks of the earthquake start, the earthquake comes. And once the earthquake comes, there's post-shocks that come afterwards. And so this is part of what I'm trying to show you is that in complex systems like the economy or human behavior or other areas of that sort, very often it's hard to predict risk. What Nassim Nicholas Taleb did in his book Anti-Fragile and in the lecture you've just seen is to try to take advantage of that secondary notion of risk that cannot be predicted or computed. And he suggests that where risk cannot be predicted or computed, such as is the case in many financial areas, we have to instead look at people's responses to risk. We can't measure the risk, he says, but we can measure what's going to happen to you if a risk occurs and comes true and actually has some implications for you. And that's when he distinguishes between the concept of fragile, saying that if a very unlikely fat end of the tail event occurs, you're going to fall apart and break, versus robust, meaning you can sort of survive anything, whether it's a normal placid day or whether it's extremely volatile. You'll be no better or worse, sort of stoic behavior, versus anti-fragile, where you're actually looking forward to experiencing those once-in-a-lifetime events because you'll do even better when they occur. I'm looking for that lotto ticket. I'm looking for that thing that's going to change my life forever, that maybe terrifies other people because they're fragile and they'll fall apart when it happens, but that I myself will benefit from it. That's one concept of how he says we can approach risk, is to look at how well positioned are we to take advantage of those black swans, those once-in-a-lifetime things that we don't expect to occur but somehow come true. Another thing that he mentions in these videos that's important is this concept of what kills me helps others. So to distinguish this, there are two different concepts. One is hormesis and one is selection. Hormesis says what kills individual parts of me helps the whole of me. So for example, if I take a little bit of wine at dinner every night, alcohol is a poison. It causes liver cancer and other toxic results in the human body. But small amounts of it, taken in moderate doses over a period of time, actually have beneficial effects, such as reducing heart attacks or stroke risks. Same goes with things like taking poisons of any sort. Small little doses of poison can actually confer immunity upon us, so that small amounts will actually of damage will actually do great benefits. We are anti-fragile as people. If we receive small amounts of inconvenience in our lives, it can make us hardier and better functioning individuals. What's interesting also is this idea of selection that he brings up. The concept being that if individuals are harmed or individual groups are harmed, the collective does better. And the example of this he gives is airplanes. I hope you saw that in the lecture, that when an airplane crashes, overall, we're going to have obviously harm that comes out of that particular airplane crash, fatalities and so forth, but airplanes will do better overall and fewer lives will be lost as a result of any given airplane crash because the crash will be studied, safety measures will be implemented to upgrade the other airplanes in the fleet, and fewer crashes will occur in the future. Same idea goes for restaurants. If a restaurant dies because the entrepreneur did not do things correctly and didn't succeed in the marketplace, other people will learn from those mistakes and create better and better restaurants with better quality experiences, food, and so forth. And so overall, the restaurant industry performs better from every restaurant that fails. It's kind of a paradox, but what it says is that at the gross macro level, the society succeeds even where individuals fail. Of course, we want to protect people who have failed. There's got to be some sort of social safety net that once you fail, you're still able to get up on your feet and try again. If you die every time you fail, well, then there's no incentives left to try as an individual to do those insane things like start a restaurant when you have no experience in it, because there's nothing to protect you once you're on the downside of eating out of cans of beans because you can't afford to live anymore. All this to say the following, that it's a very interesting concept that rather than measuring risks, we measure the effects of risks on individuals and populations to see, is the individual anti-fragile? Will they succeed when the risks get extreme? Will the population be anti-fragile? Will we as a society succeed if extreme risks come along? And so these are important questions to ask. One important caveat that Nassim Taleb brings up that we need to take into account is that anti-fragility, fragility, all these concepts only work over a certain range of risk. Of course, if the risks ever get too extreme, we're not going to succeed as a population. If nuclear bombs go off all across the globe, no humans are going to survive. There's nobody anti-fragile to a nuclear bomb blast. And so there's only a range of risks for which anti-fragility is a valid concept. And beyond that range, it becomes impossible to survive for anybody. What I want to suggest is that in general, we can't measure things that are in these financial relationships or in other very complex systems causing risks. It's hard to tease out causality the way we did in some of those science measures earlier in this class. But I want to suggest that certain extensive macroeconomic policies can actually cause extreme risk and cause systemic fragility. That is, the whole society is susceptible to contagion and to damage because of certain government interventions that cause greater and greater risk levels to be reached. Levels that may mean that nobody is anti-fragile and that nobody can come out of it unscathed. And there's two different areas that I want to talk about in the coming lectures that are going to be of great macroeconomic concern to all individuals and that we need to take into account. Now, these are only two areas. I could have picked from 20 different areas or 50 different areas, and not everyone is going to agree. And in fact, the majority of modern day economists will not agree with the two areas I've picked out as areas of significant concern that make society more fragile as a whole and less anti-fragile. And those two particular areas of government intervention in monetary and fiscal policy are number one, paper money, fiat money, and number two, free trade zones. And the combination of the two, I contend, is going to create greater extremes and greater risks in society and perhaps less anti-fragility and more fragility among our populations. So let's get started by looking in the next lecture at paper money and the implications for our society of using it. I hope you enjoy these lectures. See you soon.